You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lee Miller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. A lot of couples struggle to talk about sex, not because they don't care about each other, but because conversations about intimacy can feel incredibly vulnerable. Too often, people only talk about sex when there's a problem, which means that every discussion starts to feel loaded with pressure, shame, defensiveness, or fear of rejection. In today's episode, we're talking about how couples can communicate about intimacy in healthier and more productive ways. We'll explore the role that shame plays in complicating sexual communication, how partners can avoid turning sexual conversations into battles about self-worth, and what it takes to rebuild emotional and erotic connection after periods of avoidance or disconnection. We'll also explore what to say and what not to say when you have a sexual concern you'd like to discuss. I am joined once again by Michelle Fischler, an ASTO certified sex therapist with over a decade of clinical experience. She is also an educator and the founder of Get Some, a platform and podcast dedicated to dissolving sexual shame. She is also author of the new book, Coming Soon, The Unshaming Guide to Early Ejaculation and Lasting Longer. This is going to be another fascinating and very practical conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. If you love the science of sex as much as I do, consider becoming a friend of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. The Kinsey Institute is the world's premier research organization on sex and relationships, and you can help them continue the legacy of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, whose pioneering research changed everything we think we know about sex. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to make an impact. Your donations can help support ongoing research projects on critical topics. You can also show your support by following Kinsey Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for supporting sex science. Okay, Michelle, let's talk about talking about sex. So a lot of long-term partners struggle to communicate about intimate issues. They don't know how to do it without triggering shame, defensiveness, anxiety, or conflict. So let's start there. Why are conversations about intimacy so hard for so many people?
Well, it's layered. I would say a big part of it is what we've learned growing up, whether it be through religion, culture, family of origin, these ideas of what sex represents, and believing that it's true. You know, sex is really, really vulnerable, and our worst nightmare is to be criticized during sex when we're just trying to experience pleasure. Mm-hmm. And so people they'll get into their head versus being in their body, which gets in the way of them being able to feel pleasure, but they're terrified. And being able to have conversations about what happens to you when the two of you are having sex and something happens that wasn't part of the plan. What does that mean for you? What are some of the fears? And then where does this come from? Because when it comes to people's relationship with sex, it's pretty muddy. It's messy. Mm-hmm. They can't kind of pinpoint things. And that's why I think the more of a narrative process, especially when you're working with couples, you can do that together where you can say, hey, tell me a bit about your relationship with sex, and observing them, and can they listen to each other? Mm-hmm. Because people tend to breathe and get a bit softer when they hear the story behind whatever's happening in sex that is causing concern.
And I think you bring up a lot of important points there, including the fact that people just place so much value and emphasis on sex and what it means in their relationship. You know, many people are looking at their sex life as sort of the barometer for their overall relationship. And if things aren't going well in their sex life, then that starts to spill over into all these other aspects of their relationship. But I think, another part of the issue here is that a lot of people want to have better communication around sex in their relationships. But the only time they ever talk about sex is when there's a problem. And if you're only talking about sex when it's bad and never when it's good, that starts to make every conversation about the topic feel especially loaded or even threatening. So I think, part of the answer, part of the solution here is figuring out how to just normalize conversations about sex in relationships. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and how we can kind of like dial down some of the pressure just by normalizing talking about sex and not only talking about it when it's a problem.
Yeah, it's normalizing the conversation and also building trust between them.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm with couples and we're talking about sex, I have no time for people to start shooting bullets at each other because I'm trying to create a space that feels really safe, that likely felt very unsafe for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so after a while, they get it. But it's like, can I trust you that I'm going to say something vulnerable and you're not going to like get mad at me?
Mm-hmm.
And so the trust piece is huge. People also worry that they don't want to have conversations when things are feeling really good in their relationship because then they think it's going to make it bad.
Right.
And it's like trying to encourage people to have conversations and that you'll actually feel better after them because people do, but it often takes them being in the office and to be able to like model what those conversations can look like to build trust so that when they do it outside of the office, it feels safer. And also to have boundaries, right? To have rule, like how are we going to protect our relationship? How are we going to keep it safe? Like taking responsibility for their relationship. I'm not going to be there all the time, right? And it really takes two people to be very intentional about this.
Yeah. I think you're so right. It takes mutual buy-in from both partners here if we're talking about a couple in terms of how they're going to work on and improve their sexual communication. Now, tying this conversation in with what we discussed in the previous episode about early ejaculation, we talked a bit there about the role of shame, just more broadly, but shame is also a factor that can play a role in sexual communication in terms of inhibiting it. And, sometimes when you've got, say, a physical issue in a relationship, somebody has early ejaculation or they have arousal difficulties, even if they go to therapy, get treatment, the problem resolves, the shame might still be present, right? And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how shame can linger in relationships even after the original concern has been addressed, and then how that shame just further complicates the communication.
Yeah, shame is a tricky thing. It is one of those ideas, beliefs about themselves that people often don't share. They're terrified, right? And so it's often something that is kind of a bit of a secret. And so when I see people, it's sometimes the first time that they've ever said anything out loud. Mm-hmm. And that message, that meaning that they have attributed to it often has roots that are not in a sexual situation necessarily, but go really like far back into their history, right? It could be as simple as even, somebody who is really good at school, right? Has had a lot of positive reinforcement about how smart they are. And so they want more of that, right? And so you develop this almost perfectionistic kind of way of thinking. So doing anything that isn't goal oriented, they don't understand it. And when there's that secret inside of them that hasn't been exposed, what can be really, really healing, and sometimes it starts with me, but ideally it happens within the couple, is that it can be put out there when the relationship feels safe, and to have somebody hear it that they really care about and to say, oh my gosh, like that is so helpful for me. And that is not how I ever see you. And I love that part about you. It is incredibly healing. It's like being witnessed. And so I was on this mission because talking about shame is difficult. People tend to almost like dissociate, right? Where it's just like too much. I took this course for a year with David Bedrick, and he's done a lot of work with shame. And I wanted to know how I can try to keep them present without losing them in the space. And that goes for both of them, even with a couple. And a lot of it is very somatically based, right? So instead of going through the story and like the cognitive part of the shame and the thinking of it. It's more like, where does that show up in your body and becoming more familiar? Because some people don't even notice that it's been there their whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so when people can start to notice, oh, that feeling showing up again, they can connect it to a time that actually is outside of the relationship, and then can start to become aware of like, what can we do when that starts coming up again? So it becomes a bit of how that shame shows up in the body is a bit of barometer of like what I need and how can we support each other in feeling safe.
So I want to talk about some practical tips for how we can become better at communicating about sex in our relationships. But before we do that, let me ask what not to do. So as a couples therapist, I mean, I'm sure you've seen some counterproductive communication patterns that have emerged at times, things, for example, that might escalate shame rather than reduce it. So what should we not do when it comes to talking about sex?
Okay. Don't talk about it like in the moment when emotions are really, really high. I think it's good to just take a little break, get your clothes back on. I often say like no more than a couple hours before sex and a couple of hours after sex.
Mm-hmm.
But it's about listening, right? Trying to hear and listen and understand your partner with what they're trying to tell you, and vice versa. People get very reactive and defensive, are trying to like get one person to come over to their side,
Mm-hmm.
Especially like in desire. But I want you to I want you to have spontaneous desire. I want you to like be with me, like, right. Like when I'm horny, I want you to be horny. Well, that's not the goal here. The goal here is like, how do we work together? How do we negotiate? How do we figure out what each other's needs are? So yeah, do not create an unsafe space where you are punishing or getting mad at somebody for how they are doing sex with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's so true. And unfortunately, like a lot of conversations do go that direction where people end up pathologizing their partner's sexuality in the way that it's experienced. And, some people just have responsive desire and other people are more spontaneous, and one is not more right or better than the other. But if you're trying to fundamentally change your partner's sexual desire or style, that's just not really going to work. And if you're making them feel bad about it and increasing feelings of shame about it, it's not going to go anywhere productive.
No, not at all. No finger pointing.
Yeah.
That's important.
So let's assume that somebody has a problem in their sex life that they'd like to discuss. Like they want to talk about it with their partner because they want to work on it. How do you bring up a sexual difficulty in a productive way that's going to reduce the odds that it turns into conflict or shaming or something else?
Yeah, if it feels really high stakes, I always think it's nice to have a conversation while the two of you are maybe doing something, whether it's like going for a walk, where it's not like, you're sitting somebody down and they think that you're about to tell them something really, really bad, and then like they get scared. You can start by testing out the waters instead of going right into something very specific. It can even be about like, how do you want to talk about sex, right? Like if we're going to have conversations about this, like what would be a way that would make it feel safe for both of us? I also think that if you're the one that has the thing that you want to bring up, people tend to be like, well, what do you think about our sex life?
Right.
And they're sussing it out. They put the other person on display. And rather than, hey, look, there's something I wanted to talk about. It's like the whole I way of talking, right? Which is like, I'm struggling with something, or I think I might need for us to slow things down, right? I think maybe when we are in certain positions, I come fast, right? Like maybe there's a way that we can switch things around a little bit. And hey, like if I do come fast, like what are maybe some things that we can do that would feel really good? You got to figure out the temperature of the relationship, because conversations about sex should not piggyback on a fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Save that for another time.
Yeah. Exactly. You'll just make it worse, right? And there's a lot of undoing that has to happen when people fight about sex.
Hey guys, have you ever wanted more from your orgasms? Then you're going to want to check out Load Boost from VB Health. VB Health has a simple mission: creating supplements that work. Load Boost is designed to improve the taste, volume, and overall health of your semen. This doctor-formulated supplement can help to enhance your orgasms and pleasure and support your fertility at the same time. VB Health takes quality seriously. Made in the USA and NSF certified, their products are produced in an FDA-registered facility. They even share their third-party lab results publicly because they value trust and transparency. This isn't anything like the junk they're selling in a gas station. Thousands of guys from all across the US and 45 different countries have already tried Load Boost, and over 88% of the reviews are 4 or 5 stars from verified buyers. Elevate your performance with Load Boost. You just might become someone's new favorite performer. Learn more and get yours at loadboost.com. Visit loadboost.com and use code Justin for 10% off, or click the link in the show notes. So don't have the conversation like in the middle of sex. Don't do it while you're in the middle of another argument about something else unrelated, because that's not going to go anywhere good. Try to find a time when you're both calm, relaxed, and can have this discussion with one another. And it could be, like you said, while you're out doing another activity, taking a walk or so forth. Sometimes people find it easier in those situations rather than, like you said, just sitting face to face. And, that just kind of makes it feel even more personal and more vulnerable in that case.
Totally. And they are hard conversations, right? They are vulnerable conversations. But it's really important to figure out how each other handles that with each other too. Because if you are really wanting to have like a healthy conversation, but your partner just isn't open to that, I mean, that's good information. And sometimes that means that you have to go and maybe get support from a therapist to try to figure that out. Or maybe the two of you both go in for therapy to try to figure out how you have these conversations with each other. But they definitely should be planned, right? Like, I think some people are better at talking. Some people will lose their thoughts. That happens to me sometimes. So sometimes, like, I might want to write down a few things. Maybe it feels scary, tense, and maybe we give each other something like we write something to each other first, we sit with it, and we have a rule, right? When we come back together, maybe I would say something like, hey, something that I might do differently is blah, 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 right? Versus one person becoming the problem. Because if it's happening to the two of you. It is a relationship concern. It means that both of you have to negotiate. It's not just one person who has to make all the changes.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to sexual communication, of course, it's a two-way street. And we need to be mindful of the fact that even if one partner is expressing themselves very well, the other partner might interpret it in a totally different way. For example, one partner might say, well, I want more intimacy, or I want more sex. And the other one hears, well, I'm failing you, or something along those lines. And so we need to learn how we can get better at hearing what our partner's saying without it immediately going to something that we take personally or we feel is a verdict on our self-worth. But I know it's much easier said than done, but a lot of people struggle with this, where it's hard when your partner tells you that there's a problem to not take it personally.
Totally. And it's also how you process. When I work with couples, maybe one person has ADHD, or really is that person who they take something in and then they think about it. And there's a bit of a pause before they answer, where the partner will be just get so upset, right? But no one's ever really explored what's happening to you in that moment and paying attention to what's coming up in your body. Because if the two of you are in a conversation and it starts to feel like it's starting to escalate, being able to notice, how do you know it's starting to escalate? And often that's because we're feeling sensations in our body, kind of similar to when you're learning when you're going to ejaculate, right? I use the scale for that too. We need to understand that we're all different. that one way of doing things is not better than the other way, and that there is space where we need to negotiate. But I do think the listening and having your partner feel like you're understanding them and like validating, supporting is going to be really, really helpful, but it has to go both ways.
Yeah. And this is reminding me, I do a lot of work around sexual fantasies and how we communicate about them in relationships. And, a lot of the advice that I would give there would be similar to how you're going to have a discussion about dealing with sexual problems and issues. And one way to start that is with validating your partner first, right? Letting them know that you love them, you're attracted to them, you find them desirable, all these other sorts of things. Because all too often, like when people share like a desire or fantasy or thing they want to try, partners sometimes interpret that as, well, I'm not attractive to you anymore, or you don't like having sex with me or something. And so you need to try and do some work first to make it feel like it's a safe space and validate your partner in the process, just to even have them be receptive to hearing what it is that you're saying so that their mind doesn't immediately go to this place of questioning their own self-worth.
Yeah, I am always fascinated how it's almost more comfortable to jump into a sexual situation and hope that it goes okay versus talking about it.
Yeah.
Honestly, like blows my mind. And now maybe that's because I grew up listening to Sue Johansson, Sex with Sue. And so
I did too.
Oh, you did too, right? And it was all about listening to her communicate and like the relief that people felt, and it was taking the shame out of it. And all too often, people don't realize it, but when they're listening to their partner, they're kind of making judgments.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to point that out and really slow it down, I think is a bit of a humbling experience for them, but ultimately helpful. And then I also asked them to think about and to remember, how did you feel the last time you had a conversation about sex? Everybody comes out saying, yeah, it was hard, but we felt closer after.
Mm-hmm.
So having some of that mental memory and reminders is good too.
So what advice would you give to someone whose partner just completely shuts down whenever sex is discussed? I think this is a really common dynamic in some long-term relationships. One partner wants to talk because they want more connection or want to work on some type of change, while the other experiences the conversation as criticism or pressure. And, after enough of those, sort of difficult conversations that don't go anywhere, people can just start avoiding the topic altogether because it just feels emotionally unsafe. So how do you approach that dynamic in a way that lowers defensiveness and helps both people feel more supported instead of feeling attacked?
Yeah, the avoidance piece is real.
Mm-hmm.
When we think about avoidance, we have to think about, well, what is it about, right? Getting a bit of insight around, well, what might be causing somebody to not want to have those hard conversations? And I don't know if you've ever been with somebody who's a bit avoidant to those conversations. I have.
Mm-hmm.
And it was difficult, right? Because you feel burnt out. Like you're always trying to talk to them, but which is actually kind of pushing them away because there's some kind of belief that they have around, oh man, like, what if I'm found out? And often, if you're lucky, I mean, usually when we think of relationships, one person's usually less avoidant than the other. It's hard to have two avoidant people together because, I mean, those are often the people who haven't had sex in like 10, 15, 20 years. They come into therapy like, let's have sex again. But it's really about understanding what that person needs, the one that's like less inclined to talk, what is going to potentially make it less high stakes for them. And so again, having those walks, like having it so that it doesn't feel so serious and heavy. Yeah, figuring out like what is it that is keeping them from that, but also like what can they do for their partner who really needs some information, right? So sometimes that means setting up a time to talk, but recognizing that when you have that conversation, when you're outside of that conversation, that person knows that they're not going to be, prodded, right? So it's creating trust with the conversation, but knowing that there is a responsibility for both people to show up for each other. Yeah, I also think like with avoidance anyways, some therapy might be helpful, right? And then the person who's like pursuing, I think it's therapy for them too, but to understand like the pattern, like how long has this been going on for, right? Like, is this new? Is this been going on for a long time? Like, did something happen? Right? Because maybe there was a situation where, I don't know, the person who's avoidant used to ask for sex all the time, but they kept being shut down, right? So maybe they went into an avoidance pattern to protect themselves. Everyone's different, but it's being curious, not making assumptions, but asking questions instead of accusing.
And I think one of the other keys to sexual communication in relationships is really normalizing those conversations very early on. I'm sure as a sex therapist, you've probably seen some couples who've been together a very long time, years, maybe even decades, who have just never talked about sex. And the longer you go without talking about it, the harder it becomes, because it just becomes even more high stakes because it's this thing that you've avoided for years and years and years.
I know my favorite actually is when I have younger couples who barely can say the word sex, and that with practice, with just coming in for sessions and really like not pushing them, but like talking about sex where it doesn't feel so friggin' serious.
Mm-hmm.
There's laughter that can happen in the sessions that I'm in with people, not because I'm laughing at them, but because sex is kind of funny sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you can almost start to insert a lighter way of talking about it, I think it kind of changes the brain too, right? Mm-hmm. You're like, oh, it doesn't always have to be bad. So you're just like repeating healthier conversations so that when you're faced with a situation, you know now that it can also go well.
Right. That reminds me of some recent research that I saw that looked at how when couples infuse some humor into their sexual communication, that it makes it more effective and people are more responsive to it because it helps to induce like a little bit of levity. Because as you mentioned, all too often the sex talks that people have are just all serious, all business. And that also makes them harder to have, right? When you can talk about sex in a way that is more fun and playful, which is, how sex is supposed to be anyway. It's better when it's fun and playful for most people. If you can infuse some of those elements into your conversations about it, it can help to break the tension a little bit, help put the partners at ease, make you feel more relaxed. And that's really kind of the key to navigating these conversations in a healthy way.
Yeah. It's also hard to have a conversation about sex and be laughing if you're not really laughing and being playful. Mm-hmm. Outside of the bedroom. So there's also that element too. It's something that is learned, right? Just because it's something that you haven't experienced in the past and that maybe they haven't always gone well, there are other ways of doing these things, right? And it's about really just putting on a different lens, right? Sometimes we just don't even question the messages that we have about sex. And so my role is really just to bring an awareness and then also to let people know, hey, look, you have choice, right? There's this thing that's really bothering you and it was a message that you keep coming back to and it's been with you for so many years. Like, what's the risk of like shifting that? What are you worried about? Like if you let yourself off the hook, if you let yourself think, oh, I'm not broken and I deserve pleasure, what's the risk of that? Because people, sometimes they don't realize it, but they actually think that the harder they are on themselves, that they'll somehow like do better. But there's like no research that supports that.
No.
At all.
No. Well, thank you so much for sharing all these tips on sexual communication with us, Michelle. It was a pleasure to have you here and learn from you. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Yeah. So for my book, the landing page is comingsoonbook.com.ca. You can find it on Amazon and bookstores that are your favorite. And then if you're looking for other sexual wellness type tools, you can go to my website at getsome.ca. And you can follow me on Instagram at getsome_podcast. Oh yeah, and I have a podcast. It's called Get Some, and it's mostly all about shame.
Well, I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.